Hi everyone! So season 4 is around the corner, the moment we have been waiting for what feels like months at this point. And of course, as always, we went in and updated all of the planners, all of the guides here on Maxroll, and of course the tier lists. So the other day we had a big Maxroll tier list meeting. It went on for like 3 hours or something. And we discussed how good are the builds that we got, because the entire game is changing, the meta is shaking up, and we try to give our best guess here as a team. So I want to present you the tier list, in particular the endgame / pit tier list. That is probably like the most important here, because we actually have a real kind of difficult endgame now. So we have that, but we also made a bossing tier list, a speed farming tier list, and a bunch of other stuff that you can find on the page. And I will go over those briefly as well. Now, I do want to mention that some of this is based on speculation, because we don't have the full picture of the patch notes. So we did get the patch notes like a week ago, and of course we went through that, and there was also this campfire chat where they talked about stuff. But ultimately, a lot of information is missing from those patch notes, in particular the temper changes. There is no mention of anything whatsoever, and there are also some other question marks or stuff that might get stealth changed, stealth nerfed. There were a lot of bugs that we don't know which of those are fixed and which not. For example, I talked about the golem mastery and skeletal mastery stuff for necros. That is like 100% getting fixed, I think. But there's also other bugs that, you know, may either buff or nerf certain things. So we don't really know 100%. We just try to estimate, okay, what is likely to get changed and in what way. But ultimately, the exact numbers might make a difference in some cases. In particular, for builds that heavily rely on temper affixes, with Blizzard saying that some of the temper affixes are likely to get tuned down, especially those overperforming ones. So I expect, for example, that we're not gonna see like these insane values on all of those mods. But ultimately, we'll have to see and wait for the final patch, so we just can give our best guess. And let's get into it. So here's the tier list. This is the endgame tier list. We're starting with F for Flurry tier. And well, in general, it looks like the class balance is actually fairly decent this time around, I gotta say. We have two very strong classes, being number 1, the Necro, number 2, the Druid. And then we have a little bit behind that probably the Barb and the Sword. However, at the very high end, I guess it kind of like equalizes a little bit more, because eventually we expect builds to be so powerful that they will still kind of trivialize everything in the game. And this means that classes will kind of converge a little bit. And then we also have the Sorc. And Sorc is probably not as powerful at the start, but it will kind of like pop off more and more later once you have the typical, like, you know, full cooldown combo, and you can kind of just spam everything. And Sorc kind of requires a bit more of stuff to get the engine going. But ultimately, there are really good builds for all classes, including the Rogue, surprisingly. Like, I expected the Rogue to be kind of like way further behind than we actually see on those tier lists. And the reason why it's not that far behind is actually because of some new victimized technology. So especially Mippy has been working on some stuff here, and he has been cooking some builds. For example, the Shadow Step Rogue, that is something that I had a dream for to make at some point as well, like a long time ago. And it seems like this is actually becoming a real build this patch around due to some changes there. But ultimately, if you think about the effort required of actually being successful with any of those builds, then there's definitely by far the least effort on the Necromancers. Necromancers are absolute kings in Season 4. This is a Necromancer season, just like in Diablo 3 right now. We have the Necromancer season. Now we have it here as well. So Diablo 4 is really becoming Diablo 3 right now, with the pit and with Necromancers being at the top. Those minion necros are absolutely busted, and even with, you know, some of those expected nerfs that are going to happen, they will still remain at the top and will reign supreme. Now the thing is, this is a minion build, not everyone likes that, and it's just like kind of, in my opinion, plain boring to play such a playstyle, but this will be a super easy way to get through the game and just be successful in Season 4. The thing about Minion Necro is also, it just doesn't require anything to start functioning properly. Like, we also put the tier list here for the leveling builds, and here we also have Minion Necro at the top, because you just kind of like have minions and you exist, and everything dies, basically. So this is how that build works, and it's completely crazy how strong that is. So even with any kind of like stealth nerfs that might sneak into the patch or so, even if they nerf it by like 80% or so, it will probably still be at the top, basically. This is how overpowered and busted it was on the PTR, because those minions were just kind of like crushing everything without any effort. So that is that. And there's, well, a lot of other builds here, as you can see. So we have some other top builds here. There's Bone Spirit Necro. Kind of interesting because you can kind of like refill your almost entire resource bar every time you shoot Bone Spirit, and can kind of just spam it, doing like hundreds of millions of damage. So that's the expectation. That seems very strong as well. And we have Tornado Turret back in S tier. So that is probably the longest reigning top tier build of all time so far in Diablo 4. And it's back because of some new Hunter Zenith tech and the quick shift. It's like swapping between forms all the time. It does a lot of damage. So if you like to play a druid, you're gonna have a good time. But there's other stuff as well. The Hurricane build, it actually turns out to be really powerful. It got a massive buff in the final patch notes. Lightning Storm is up there, Boulder's up there. So Druid has a bunch of really good stuff here, mostly Storm-based builds. But there's that. And we have the Barbs. They are surprisingly not in S tier with a single build. So look at that. So we have Bash Barb, which we expect to be one of the best here. The Twisters got heavily nerfed, and we don't really expect them to be like the #1 ultra choice, basically. So we have Double Swing Twister there, Whirlwind Twister. Those Dust Devils have been getting massive buffs in the PTR and then massive nerfs again. And ultimately, it's still quite a net gain, but it's not gonna kind of just destroy everything. And yeah, Barbs are gonna be just fine. They're basically unkillable tanks. So that's a huge advantage of Barbs in general, because survivability is a massive issue on the higher end, especially in the pit, for example. And well, playing a Barb is kind of the easy mode of this game in terms of survivability. So if you feel like, okay, you want to just one-shot everything without effort, you can play a Necro. And if you want to maybe kill stuff slightly slower, but also be invincible, then you can probably play a Barb. So that's kind of how that goes. The good thing is that all classes have quite a lot of variety this time as well, because with the changes to itemization and all these crazy combos you can do in basically any of those classes, you can actually make a lot of builds work. So if you look at this tier list here right now and you see like one of your favorite builds is down in C tier or something like that, you know, like for example, I really like Walking Arsenal Barb, or I really like Deathtrap Broke. They're still quite playable. It's not like these builds are, you know, unusable and they're going to be like a massive effort to get to level 100 or something like that. Some builds have it way easier because, you know, passive infinite damage kind of, and other builds, well, require some more effort, but ultimately they can all get through the game just fine, and they will all be able to do, like, even the Tormentor bosses most likely, maybe with, you know, a bit of gameplay and dodging and all that stuff. But it's not like you are locked out of anything, even playing those worse builds. They may just progress a bit slower. They may not go that high in the pit. Right now, we don't really know how hard the pit will be. My expectation personally is that pit level 200 is going to be unreachable, and Blizzard is going to like times 1000 the monster HP or something like that on the highest tiers. And it's supposed to be like an infinite difficulty, because on the PTR, basically anything on this list was actually able to clear all the way to pit 200, which is supposed to be the highest challenge in the game. And the pit being the kind of, what do they say, endgame measuring stick of builds, wasn't exactly really doing its job, basically, because it was just way too easy on the highest tiers. So I would expect a massive turnaround there, and the pits on the highest tiers just being unreachable even for those top tier builds. But I guess we'll see. Depending on how hard it will be to reach the highest tiers, we will see more of a, or less of a gap between builds. Because if pit 200 is going to be very easy, then you will actually not really notice such a massive difference between builds compared to when there's infinite difficulty and you see that certain builds just have 100 times the damage than other builds. And of course, you know, the mini Neko might go to like 150, and maybe a C tier build will go to 100 or something like that. So this is depending on how much the balance of the game has changed. Now let's talk about Zork here for a second as well. Some people might be asking, oh, what about the Frosty Stride Zork? Well, personally, I don't expect this to be even a thing, to be honest. I expect this to be heavily nerfed to the point where it's just kind of unusable. We have seen these kind of perma teleport low life barrier builds that people are playing on the PTR with the new Frosty Strides aspect. I can show that off real quick here. There's this one where it's a utility aspect that basically creates this entire build where you just like evade, and you deal massive amounts of damage around you. And that damage was a ridiculous number. It was like 90,000 damage or something like that, base damage, which is like more than any other effect in the game, and it could hit for like dozens of millions or something with a single teleport, basically. So it seems very, very optimistic that, like, to assume that this actually makes it into the patch, I think. There is not specifically a mention in the final patch note that this was changed, but you also see here that there is not a mention of any damage number. So it just says it does cold damage. And this is one of those kind of hidden changes that I expect to make it into the patch because of how ridiculous that thing was. And also it's a utility aspect. It's not supposed to actually, you know, kind of destroy everything one shot, I guess. So we'll see. Of course, this doesn't really change the way that this Frosty Strides build would be played, so depending on how much it's nerfed, it might still be a kind of like a viable endgame choice for the Sorks, and maybe even potentially the best one. But ultimately, for now, we're kind of like conservative here, and we're not trying to, you know, make people believe into a build that might not even exist, basically. So we try to make a kind of conservative estimate here that is realistic with what we know about what is changing in our PTR, with, you know, just our expectations of how Blizzard is going to handle this patch based on what we've seen in the past. And this is what we got. In the end, the entire game is changing pretty massively, and even with like, you know, a dozen blasters going ham on the PTR for a full week, with how much everything has changed, we have not really seen the entire picture of, you know, what is possible, of the theory crafts and everything. And there's actually a lot of stuff that kind of popped up over time in the last weeks after the PTR was already closed and with the final patch notes. So in the end, we have to see, and there's probably going to be more stuff popping up when the season goes live. Now, finally, let's go into some of the other tier lists here. So I talked about the leveling. This is like, you know, early game, like 1 to 50 or so. Just to get a bit of an idea, I talked about the minion echo being super easy, but we have rogues up there, we have sorks up there. They're gonna have no trouble going fast and going out all the way to the 100 really quickly. And then we moved a lot of the druid stuff down because with the new meta of leveling up, which is mostly Helltide farming, some of these builds kind of like suffered a little bit from the lack of single target damage. There's a lot of elites in Helltide, and you don't just farm dopamine tunnels anymore. And you just don't just require only AoE, and that's it. So that's why this tier list has changed a little bit in the grand scheme of things, with how easy the game is becoming in the early game, and with the season journey aspects coming in, giving you some of those very important aspects and items that you might want to use for a certain leveling setup. It's not going to be hard to level up even as a druid. But you have to see that druids are very reliant on uniques compared to other classes. So even after going into World Tier 3, World Tier 4, you kind of have to go start farming some of those bosses as well. You look at a Tempest Roar for all these storm builds, for example. Like, we have Tornado here that needs a Tempest Roar. We have Hurricane that needs one. We have Lightning Storm that needs one. And some of these other are also, like, here's Boulder Druid that is entirely reliant on even having a unique to work. So in general, there is a bit more like effort required to get a Druid rolling, I guess, compared to some of the other classes. But they are going to be very strong at the top. Here's also our speed farming tier list. This mostly includes stuff like open world, hell tides, and so on. TLDR, a lot of builds can go very fast and one-shot stuff there, so I'm just gonna glance over this real quick. It's just a few builds that are just kind of like too slow with how the mechanics works, like for example Bloodlands and these kind of things. Grenade Rogue. So some of these builds are just not really great. It's just flying across the screen and one-shotting everything. But you can make anything work. If you just want to have some fun and easy content, lower tier pits, or, you know, maybe tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons or so, which is kind of considered relatively easy now, I guess, with the pit being the ultimate challenge. A lot of builds can crush all that stuff easily with, you know, all the mobility in the game. In general, the game is speeding up a lot. Everyone has a lot of attack speed. Everyone has a lot of movement speed. Even the Necros, they go fast. And you're gonna feel like this kind of like blast mode coming online with your builds as you progress, as you get a better loot and temper your items. So all of those builds are going to be very fast in easy tier content, basically. And finally, we have a brand new bossing tier list as well. So I want to go over that real quick. The bosses are really important to get your uniques and uber uniques, and they have introduced level 200 tormented bosses. They're going to be like some of the highest challenges in the game now as well. And there are certain builds that are obviously better than others at doing a lot of single target damage. So we're going to have this tier list here as well, with again kind of like the same old candidates at the top, but we also have a few like specific bossing builds. For example, here's the one-shot rogue. I already made a video about this. For example, this is like these Banished Talisman wombo combo build that the rogue has here, that is only good for bosses and nothing else. But you can swap to that and then farm those bosses a bit, for example. And other builds just kind of like work well anyway, because, well, there's a bit of overlap here, I guess, with the pit tier list. You need a lot of damage to go high in the pit, and obviously you need a lot of damage to be high on the bossing tier list. So you see the same old candidates: Necro, Druid, there's Bash Barb, Shadow Step Rogue. So there's a bunch of stuff here, but ultimately there's also builds that you probably don't really want to put into a boss encounter, like ever, like Flurry and Whirlwind and Bloodsurge and these kind of builds. Basically, I guess that comes as no surprise. Those bosses have a lot of hit points. So if you show up there as a Flurry Rogue in a 4-man party, well, you're gonna get carried. That's just the end of story. Now, all of that brings us to the final class ranking. So as an overall class, I guess, with like how many builds are there to play that are really powerful, how easy is it to maneuver the class and be successful in Season 4, I would say from weakest to strongest, we start with the Rogue. Then I would say the Barb, the Sorc, the Druid, and then the Necro being at the top as the best class. So this is kind of like my expectation going into Season 4. Barb is kind of like mid-range, Sorc is also mid-range, but it has kind of like a different progression curve. So yeah, it starts pretty good, then it kind of falls off a bit, and then it becomes really crazy again. So there's like a bit of like this curve basically. And Barbs are just kind of like strong from the start, get better as they go. And Druids kind of like start really weak and then they pop really hard off. And we have Rogues that are just kind of like, yeah, all around somewhat mediocre basically. With, they just work, but they don't really have any crazy jumps in power. And the Necros, they're just like, they start high and they remain high all the time. So this is kind of like what to expect, I guess, going into Season 4. And of course, depending on the build, depending on how certain builds come online with some of the uniques I mentioned, like for example, a Tornado Druid, you wouldn't really want to start with a Tornado Druid necessarily until you get a Tempest Roar and so on. So that's the final tier list here that we have for Season 4 launch. And as I mentioned, of course, keep an eye on this because we're going to be updating this, probably like a few days into season or something like that, when everything has kind of been figured out and we see some more builds, some more details. We see the final patch and the temper mods and so on that I discussed. And in the end, a lot of stuff will probably shift around a little bit. Personally, I'm very excited to play Season 4 finally. I've been waiting for this. I've been working on builds. I have a lot of stuff theory crafted and I'm putting out a lot of guides right now as well. So not just, me being like part of Maxroll now, but also just in general, I'm looking really forward to this season. I think a lot of people are going to have a lot of fun. Even if I don't necessarily pick like an S tier build or an S tier class like the Necro. Like personally, I'm not really that convinced of playing a Necro, for example. I'm probably going to go Rogue or I'm going to go Barb again or something like that. And we'll see. So right now, as of recording of this video, it's Wednesday, the 8th of May, 6 days before the season start. And we want to release all of our guides somewhere around today, maybe tomorrow, do some last polishing and some last finishing touches. But this video might be live already, basically, before everything has been finished. But you can just go on these tier lists, you can click on any of those guides, and it will link you the endgame guide here, for example, on this tier list, and on the leveling tier list, it will link you the leveling guide here, for example. So all of these are clickable links. You can also find our build guides here. You can click through leveling, endgame, class filters, and so on. And we also have a new specialized build guide format that is supposed to be for like basically post level 100 builds that are not really playable in the early game. Right now it's nothing here because they're not published yet, but we have a few of those coming, including, for example, the Shadow Step Rogue. So I mentioned that one briefly at the start. This is one of those builds that are designed for like level 100 only, basically, because of certain requirements to even play the build. Versus some of the other build guides, or most of the other build guides that are our endgame builds here that actually go the progression all the way from start to finish, basically. So some of those are kind of these new specialized builds. Let us know what you think about those as well when you follow one of those guides along once they're live, because this is a new format that we're trying out here. It's kind of like a shorter version of a guide that, you know, has a full setup ready for you to play, basically. And let us know if you have any feedback. So that's it for the tier list video here. So hope you enjoyed this. I wish you good luck when the season goes live. And let me know what you're going to play, what you're excited for, what you agree or disagree with, especially if there's anything that you think we completely missed, or, you know, some crazy clips or anything like that. I'll be kind of curious to keep an eye out for that. And otherwise, I think it's just going to be a fun season. So I'm looking forward to it. Hope you too. Hope you enjoyed this video here, and see you guys next time.